Hey guys, we are trying something new, going to Crowdcast and trying to get this to work on Facebook. So it looks like it is working. And so if you have any questions, just put them in the comments and we will answer. Yes, there's no one in Crowdcast, Michael. It's all going to be in Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is something new for us. So today I just want to talk a little bit about the 5 steps Michael talks about during our type 2 class. And it's actually the process that we use in our own work. A lot of times there is an issue in terms of the steps of process, you would say, Michael, with most designers and students not knowing exactly like where to start. Or sometimes you've always said that they will work on many things at one time.
Well, it's a building process. So that's really what we're talking about, this building process, is how you approach the page. Do you opt for just throwing imagery on there first, or do you actually go at it with a plan, right?
Right. So we have a couple slides to show and demonstrate. So let's get into it. Hopefully you guys have some questions, so just let us know. Shall we show these slides, Michael?
All right.
Okay, excellent. So let's do this. Give a second, guys. And then this one, we'll do the full screen, right? Full screen mode. Excellent. So hopefully you guys can see that. It looks like we can. Excellent. We're watching a little bit of a delay in Facebook, so sorry if we are kind of bewildered. We're used to directly in Crowdcast where we see things like right away, and Facebook has a bit of a little bit of delay. But again, thanks guys for joining us, and happy holidays since we're in the midst of it. Let's get started on the 5 steps. So this is the 5 steps to building a page system efficiently and effectively. Shall I go through it, Michael?
Well, here's an overview of the 5 steps. So the very first thing you want to consider is the format. So what you're building is, knowing what you're building is apparent. It has to be apparent, whether it's a small box for mints, packaging for that, or if it's a poster, or if it's for UI UX, or whatever it is. The mentality of having the finished dimensions in your head first, or at least written down so you know what to start with as far as framing it out. So that's the very first thing. The second one is the grid itself. So once you have the format, the grid is always conducive of the format. They live in one and the same kind of environment. So however narrow that packaging is, will determine how many columns, just like an 8.5:11 versus a 6:9. 6:9 would have 1 column, and an 8.5:11 would have 2 or 3, right? So it just depends on, and then a newspaper would have, since it's a larger format, can have up to 5 or 6 columns, right? So the order is what we're talking about: the format, knowing the size of the piece, then the grid that you're going to put on the pages, which is going to include the columns and a baseline grid, or some kind of horizontal division of space. The next thing that goes on the page, or the pages, is the text. So I was always taught in the beginning, and we had to do this in phototype setting, where you want to handle composition and layout first. So you want to use the most content that's being used for that piece. It should hit the page first because it's connected to the grid, which is connected to the format. So another way of putting that as well, as it was drilled in our head in the old days, was always respect the content. The content is the reason why you have the job in the first place. It's what's involved with the sales of whatever it is you're designing for and communicating for. So you want to treat that body copy with the utmost respect, so it gets first dibs on layout and composition. Number 4 is the imagery. Once you have everything fit and laid out, like these boxes show here, where the X's are, that's when you want to start to implement imagery. I always used imagery first before color, because a lot of times once the imagery hits the page and is now interacting with the text, I'm going to pull color out of those images to use in the layout. And if you look at a lot of magazines, they do the same thing. It's kind of an old habit. So then color is last. The reason why color is last is because it's so emotional. And if we put it in first, it really has kind of a negative, not a negative effect, but it deters us mentally in our subconscious level of dealing with color. It gets our eyes to go everywhere instead of concentrating on composition and layout. So each stage of this, you do it in this order because each stage demands your 100% attention instead of doing the last 3 together, whereas everything's 30% as far as your attention. Okay.
Right.
So here, when you're defining the format, here's some common sizes, right? We have the US version and the rest of the planet's version. You have which is yellow, is the US version, which is in inches, and then the rest of the planet that's in metrics is on the A system. Let's say A4 is equal to our letterhead, or 8.5 by 11. Okay, so here's just some standard sizes, and there's standard sizes in every realm of design, whether it's for bottles, for packaging, or for other types of box packaging and posters and so on. Okay. So number 2 here, when you build a grid for the format that you have, grids are conducive of what you're building. So in this case, single column grids are usually for smaller sizes, like the 6 by 9 that I mentioned, let's say, or if we're talking print format. For digital, it could be as few as like 6 columns for a banner ad, let's say. Double column or triple column grids, usually for 8.5 by 11 or a little larger, maybe an A4. And then I typically use modular grids for large sizes. Like I'll use a modular grid for a poster because it's 24 by 36 inches, and you need things to be able to calculate a number of boxes vertically and horizontally to position the elements for composition, okay, on a large scale.
So you don't just choose a grid based off of whatever. It's really based on the format size, correct?
Yeah, it depends on what you're producing too.
Right.
The 2 grids on the left, you use for a print spread format, depending on what you're producing. I won't use the column grid necessarily for packaging.
Got it.
I might use the modular grid for packaging. So it just depends on what the piece is and what you're producing.
Okay.
Yeah. Just some recap on page grid here for print. A lot of you guys know these terms, but this is just a way of showing you guys, knowing what the pieces for the elements are here. Like F is a folio, and we're talking about one page here, whereas we're typically in print we would talk about a spread. These are just terms you can find anywhere, like a column. I always refer to the width of a column as a measure. It's kind of an old term. I don't know if that's been updated or not. But the measure, the width of a column, which is called the measure, is usually measured in picas for print. Then you have modules, like areas where you're going to place visual elements like solid color or imagery. And then the margins. You have a header margin. I'm talking about C here. You have inside and outside margins. 2 inside margins on a spread are conducive of a gutter, and footer margin. And then I've always called outside margins of a spread thumb margins. It's a newspaper or editorial term because that's how you hold, a spread open. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and then just flow lines or guidelines, if you will.
You guys know those?
So with margins are important to start out with. This is the first thing you want to set right after the format. And having adequate margins for a clear area, let's say, depending on what you're working on. For advertising, it's usually 1/2 inch for print advertising. They call it the live area. But Usually it goes in this order where you're going to set the format, the margins, the columns, and then the horizontal lines, whether it be baseline or baseline grid or, just a division of space of grid lines. But just try to remember the narrower the margin around the perimeter of the page, the more tension you're going to have. Because as the content nears the edge of the page, you get a little bit more sensibility of tension. And I always equate that when we teach type 1 to how close you come to walking up to the edge of the Grand Canyon, right? That kind of little bit of tension that you have. Whereas on the opposite end, where you have more margin, you have a little bit more cushion or padding there. You have a little bit more of a relief, a sense of relief there. So same goes for the reader. Other lines to know with margins in print would be the trim size, the inner margin, and the bleed line. Those are like the three basic lines you would need to know. A bleed edge, if you want imagery to go off the edge of the page, would be 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125 inches. And then the document size, you know that, and we're talking about looking at it digitally here. Inner margin, usually default for 8.5/11 is 1/2 inch. I think a printer starts to get nervous if you get just under, or you start to approach 3/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch. They really start to get nervous about keeping that trim the same, that border all the way around. Okay. So again, once you have your margins, the next thing you're going to produce is the vertical grid or the columns. This is an example of a 12-column grid without an alley in between the columns. And I use this often for 8.5/11 when I'm just experimenting with layout. Because the reason I use 12 is because I can go 2, 3, or 4 columns, depending on what I'm going to decide on layout. And then once I decide, then I'll go back and make my margins, or my columns. Let's say if I have 2 columns, I'll put an alley in between there of a piker or something. Very next thing is to complete the vertical grid with a baseline grid, or like this, or you can just use division of space depending on how you work. I try to get in the habit of using a baseline grid if you can. It's a great way to keep content on a rhythm from page to page, spread to spread. It's not really necessary all the time, like in posters or whatever.
You guys use a baseline grid? I hope so. It really, really helps to have it as guidance.
Yeah, it's just that's exactly what it is for guidance. Doesn't mean you have to follow it in every sense of the case, but it's just to keep things in rhythm vertically on the page. So once you create the margins and the columns, we got going here. Okay. So number 2 is creating the grid. Even though we already talked about the grid. The next thing you want to try to establish is elements, the balance of elements. So in any graphic design 1 course, you're going to get these 3 options that you're going to have as far as layout. Because guys, in graphic design, it's always about 2 things and 2 things only. It's imagery and text. And whether it's image heavy, where you have a bunch of images and very little text, or you're going to have type heavy, where it's a lot of type and very little imagery, or balanced. The ones to the right here in this slide are pretty much balanced along with white space, if you will. But you're really planning on what you're going to have here depending on how much content you have. Okay, so that's the one thing to note when you're developing a grid and determining how many columns. Once you have the columns, like we said before, so in this example, we're demonstrating an 8x10 page, which is kind of unusual. It's not a typical 6x9, let's say, or an 8.5x11. It's in between, like an 8x10 page. So we have 2 columns. And the reason why we want to go over this is just to see, also get you looking at guides like this more often, getting used to looking at more guides. What we're trying to demonstrate here with columns is why we're talking about this process is trying to think ahead when you have a format. So for us, the way I've always done it, when I have the format size, I can determine what type size I'm going to have depending on the typeface and the number of words per page. And this is another way of going about it. So this is a demonstration on once you have the width in picas of the measure, 42 picas, then you can determine your type size. And that's what we're going to demonstrate here. So in this case, 42 picas is a long width, actually, to spread the page. Because in our math, this is how we do it. So if you have an optimal 50 to 70 characters per line is what we have, 42 picas doesn't yield that within a 9 to 12 body copy type size range.
Right. It creates about 98 characters per line, which is really, really long and hard for the reader to track.
That's a hint to you as designers to do something else and have another decision here. So you have a couple of options. You can make the type size larger, which isn't conducive of body copy anymore. It's more conducive of a subhead level or an intro, which will give us 58 characters per line at 21 points. Or I could cut the measure in half and get it back to body copy size at 11 over 15, and I've got around 50 characters per line. Okay, so that would be up to you, and depending on what the content is speaking and what you're trying to do with the page. Okay. So once you have the grid and you've determined everything, you can flow in the text, and the body copy usually comes first, like this example here. And then you start to massage everything and get it to lay out with imagery as well. So here's the flowing of text through columns, through spreads. And even though these are all repeated, these would typically all be different looking spreads, even though it's on a 2-column grid to start. And sometimes you may break these grids altogether. Okay, these are just examples. Once you have the content laid out like you have here, and you can see the gray boxes are in place just for composition purposes, and you've got all the content set. And for us, usually we'll style it as well, get our paragraph styles and character styles going so it's all set. Then we'll go back and add imagery and color next, and that's in this order. So place copy before imagery. Okay, so to get everything on grid. And then you go back in and you address the imagery. For us, if we're getting to the stage, in the 4th stage here where we're doing imagery, we're going to also go back and address the imagery and color balance all the photos, let's say, for our real estate client. Because we'll get a bunch of photos that are, half of them will be professionally taken, and then we'll have to supplement it with stock. And it looks like there's 5 photographers that took them. So at this stage, we'll get off the computer and go address all the imagery as a whole and then put it into the layout. Okay, so we address that all at once. So again, we're addressing the imagery with our full 100% attention. Once we have it, then we'll put it in the layout. Same goes with color. Once the imagery is in place, we'll want to pull out the color from the imagery to get a cohesive balance that is document-wide, that's going to supplement the color with the text and whatever's in the imagery. So in this case, we might just throw in the imagery if it's in black and white, or maybe it's not even in black and white, it's just a box of gray. And then we'll put in the actual imagery that the illustrators have produced for us. And then from there, like this example here, we have a brown, a green, an orange, and a yellow. We'll pull those out to use those 4 spot colors throughout the document and get the document to have a really cohesive look.
So then what is the benefits of not implementing the color until the very end?
It's the same. It's when we always talk about in branding, there's a certain process in branding when you show a logo. It's more of a 3-step method for us. We want to show symbol first in black and white, and then we want to add type to that symbol, get a sign off on that. And then once that is set and they know what the logo looks like, then we'll add color. We've been challenged many times over the years where if we get too excited and we show full-blown color, or the client demands it, of the entire logo, more like a pitch situation where you show the mark and the color and everything application, and they happen to not like that color, just the color, not the design, they won't pay attention to it or talk to it. They'll send you packing and back to the office and start over on more logos. So we always try to let our clients know that there is this certain little process that we will follow, regardless of what else is requested, that we always do it in this 3-step order: symbol, symbol plus type, symbol plus type plus color in the end. So this is kind of a larger version of that, as far as a graphic designer having discipline in his head to give complete attention to these 5 important elements separately instead of all together. I've always found over the years that I've worked a lot faster doing it this way. Having the same process every time becomes natural, and you can solve design problems a lot more effectively when you have a process like this in place, or at least a mentality. And that's what we're trying to do with Type is give you mentality.
Right. So had a little bit of mix up with the slides, but it's okay. So number 1 would be to determine the format, correct?
Format's first.
Format is first. And then the second would be the grid and the columns. Those go together, correct?
Right. Because the columns are the vertical element of the vertical, the first half of the grid as a whole.
Right.
So, yeah. Then once you have that, then you go to text and you address all the content first. You get all your styles going and determine the look of the text and make sure it reads first. That usually takes the longest for us, because once that's set, in my mind, once that's done, I'm like, okay, I'm 70% there as far as layout. And then fourth, you add imagery and you start to adjust layout a little bit depending on how the imagery is. Like if you have just box imagery, or if you have vignetted imagery that will go behind the text or whatever else, and you get that all set up. And then last, you start to add color to headlines, and you adjust the color of your type and any other, colored elements that you may provide, like rules or lines or whatever else.
And you can also keep your images in black and white up until that point as well, until you decide on that color, just so you can concentrate on one.
I always try to have designers just keep the gray box in place as long as possible, because once they put the imagery in there, they're distracted. And they go, I don't like that imagery. And now we're not talking about text and layout and composition anymore. Right. So I try to get them to keep that gray box in there as long as possible. In my mind, when I do it, I know what image is going in there. So.
Right. So let us know if you guys have any questions. Just add it to the comments below. We are totally happy to answer anything. And also, what I'm going to do is just clarify the slides there and make sure it's a little bit more clear for you guys. If you are interested in getting those slides, please just comment with yes, and I will contact you and send you the slide deck that we had today. So again, just comment with yes, and then I'll send you the slide deck. Was there anything else, Michael, in terms of your 5-step process?
No.
This is really our process. You guys might have different processes, but in terms of developing designs really fast, working through things very quickly, we found this process to be best, just to focus on one step at a time and not try to do color and styles and text and whatnot all at the same time, and then still working out the grid as you're building out pages. It just seems very distracting, and in the end takes you longer to do.
The reason why we're doing this too is because we've had a lot of interns and employees come to our office, and we found it's one of those things you have to establish to get efficient layout and going. Also time, the amount of time it takes to do these things. And design has a discipline just like any other profession. And working this way is just, has benefited us over the years. And it's a very simple, kind of fundamental way of working. But again, it's not the process out there. It's a matter of, if you don't have a process, maybe you adopt ours, or, at least try to have some kind of process to be an efficient designer, especially when you have a lot of projects.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Especially when you're handling 8 end reports at one time.
Yeah.
You have to know exactly what your steps are. Now they're
In
not
the good old days.
they're not necessarily design phases. Again, these are just steps to building a page that will help you produce faster.
Have some kind of system in place.
Yeah. Again, so it looks like everyone has commented, yes, thanks so much. I will revise the slide deck and then get it to you guys today. If you have any questions, also post them afterwards. And otherwise, I think we're done for the day. If you guys have any other questions, let us know.
All right.
All right. We'll see you guys later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for hanging with us. Bye-bye.